Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we focus on the lessons to be drawn from the current dramatic events in Afghanistan. After 20 years on coalition life support, the Afghanistan government collapsed within days, much to the embarrassment and humiliation of the USA, Britain and their NATO allies. Today we take the reaction from the White House, the House of Commons, and from the movement of the moment, the Taliban themselves. And we ask old Afghan hand and experienced commentator Peter Oborne to explain the real significance behind this week's extraordinary developments. After a full weekend holed up in Camp David, this is how Joe Biden explained away the chaotic scenes from Kabul.
The developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
The President was making the best of a bad job, but the UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace was more emotional when he broke down on a local radio station.
Our men and women of our armed forces are risking their lives in doing that, but that is the right thing to do. They've risked their lives the last 20 years, at the very least, our obligation has to be as many of these people through the pipeline as possible. But I think I also said, and it's a really deep part of regret for me, that some people won't get back. Some people won't get back, and we will have to do our best in third countries to process those people.
This was somewhat surprising, since there was no evidence at all that the evacuation centre at Kabul airport was even under attack, despite the chaotic scenes of people desperate to leave. When the Commons met on Wednesday, the mood was sombre, but the air full of recrimination.
They gave their all for our safety, and we owe it to them to give our all to prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a breeding ground for terrorism. Because no matter how grim the lessons of the past, the future is not yet written.
Can I just bring him back to the statement by the President of the United States the other day? Does he not agree with me that this took on the terms, really, of a sort of shameful excuse? When he blames the Afghan armed forces, who have lost nearly 70,000 in trying to defend Afghan, when corruption had stripped away much of their pay, their money, their support, and the American decision to withdraw the aircraft cover was almost certainly going to lead us. Does he not think that that is shameful?
The British and Afghan people will have to live with the consequences of the Prime Minister's failure. We have fought for 20 years to rid Afghanistan of terror, terror which threatens our security here in Britain and liberty in Afghanistan. The Taliban are back in control. The Prime Minister has no plan how to handle the situation, just as he had no plan to prevent it. What we've won through 20 years of sacrifice could all be lost. That is the cost, Mr. Speaker, of careless leadership. Thank you.
In July of this year, both President Biden and my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, indicated that they did not think that the Taliban was ready or able to take over control of the country. Was our intelligence really so poor? Was our understanding of the Afghan government so weak? Was our knowledge of the position on the ground so inadequate? Or did we really believe this? Or did we just feel that we had to follow the United States and hope that on a wing and a prayer it would be all right on the night?
I'm sad to say that the scheme announced last night by the UK government and today by the Prime Minister doesn't go near far enough or fast enough. It could only be right that the number of refugees we welcome here reflects the share of the responsibility the UK government has for this foreign policy disaster.
The Westminster parties seem to agree that the UK's role was now to open its doors to refugees. All very laudable, but it will leave some 38 million Afghans still in their own country. However, there was little reflection from the current crop of MPs on the wisdom of the decision 20 years ago, not just to defeat the Taliban, but to attempt to occupy and nation-build this country. This task was embarked upon despite every clear lesson of history from Alexander the Great to the British Empire to the Soviet Union. Every invading army marched into Afghanistan easily and everyone came out bloody. Meanwhile in Kabul, the victorious Taliban confounded their critics by offering conciliation instead of barbarism. This is what they had to say.
I want to give assurances to all compatriots, those on the opposition side as interpreters involved in military actions or those who helped in civilian sectors. We have granted them all amnesty. We don't want to take revenge on anyone, and those youths who are talented and are from this soil, we don't want them to leave, never. They are a valuable asset. They must stay in the country. God willing, and according to Sharia law, we will let women work and participate in activities. Women are the main symbol of our society. We respect them. Women will participate in different sectors of society, although according to the Sharia law.
So this week for the Taliban, game, set and match in the military campaign, and round one in the new propaganda war, which has largely replaced it. For 20 years, commentator Peter Oborne has followed the conflict in Afghanistan from the dawning of Operation Enduring Freedom until this week's total collapse. Today, he speaks to Alex about the real lessons behind this week's epic events.
Peter Oborne, thanks once again for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
It's a real pleasure, Alex, particularly at this momentous time.
Let's go back to the beginning. 20 years ago, in the aftermath of 9/11, this coalition put together, NATO involvement, takes over Afghanistan. But the objective then was to find Osama bin Laden and stop Afghanistan being a base for international terrorist action. Basically, what happened?
Remember, it was a very well-executed operation to begin with. The Taliban vanished almost at once, and the collection of neoconservatives surrounding George Bush embarked on the enterprise which took them to Iraq and to calamity around the world.
But there wasn't any shortage. I mean, I remember the debates in the Commons in 2001. I mean, I took part in them, and myself and Tam Dael, Peter Tapsell, that redoubtable voice in the Tory backbenches in these days. All of us, and many more, said, look...
Jeremy Corbyn, I think. Let's just give a little nod.
Absolutely,
to this
Jeremy Corbyn.
Jeremy Corbyn.
And others said, look, beware of mission creep, do the job and get out. There was so many illustrations from history, from Alexander the Great to the British Empire to the Soviet Union. Why on earth did people think it was going to be any different this time round?
It is bizarre. It was the British, in a funny way, who pushed it the second time round when they were being driven out of Iraq. Do you remember about 2005-06? And I think they wanted to retain a role. And so they asked, or suggested disastrously, as it turned out, that we went to Helmand province, which is where the bulk of the very brave British soldiers lost their lives. You know about that. I remember discussing it with you at the time because of the involvement of Scottish regiments.
Now, you've an old Afghan hand. You've made a film about the Taliban. I mean, 10 years ago, you were making a film saying, waiting for the Taliban. When you made that film back in 2010-11, was there a widespread expectation, even at that time, that the Taliban would be back?
I think there was. I think that there was never any doubt that the Taliban had not gone away. Like any guerrilla army, it had just retreated into the population. But it was a very memorable experience, having the honor of speaking to ordinary Afghans, which is what we did. Young girls or young women who were going to school and envisaged careers as lawyers or as bankers or as politicians or as school teachers or doctors. And for them, they were really afraid. Already they were thinking that they were experiencing threats and so on. And for them, the return of the Taliban, they all told us, was really really an awful thing. But at the same time, I spoke to a lot of businessmen, particularly in Kabul, who told us the exact opposite. They said, we can't run a business under the chaos and of the current, I think it was the Karzai government still then, the extortion, the corruption, kidnap threats, horrible tortures inflicted on them. And they yearned, not because they supported the Taliban, but they did remember that under the Taliban there had been law and order. And that is it's very easy for those of us in Western countries where we can take for granted an element of law and order to think it doesn't matter. But if you're trying to run a business with organized crime gangs coming after you all the time, it's a different matter, I think. And I was very struck then by the desire of decent people just to get to return to normality. And for them, the preferable normality was the Taliban.
Well, I could say, and I'm sure I'm allowed to say it now, that because the initial invasion was generally supported across the House and Parliament and a cross-party basis, this was unusual for me as a SNP politician at that time. I was given the security briefings, and I could say for definite that the information being relied on for the topography of Afghanistan was mapping done by the British forces in the 19th century. So there was plenty. If the maps were still in the Ministry of Defence, why wasn't the wisdom retained as well that this might not be the place to get into over the long term?
This is a momentous moment because we are now running up to the 20th anniversary. Next month is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And 9/11 led, of course, we can see, to the Iraq disaster, to the Afghanistan disaster, and more sort of tangentially maybe to the Libyan disaster. And I think that what the mistake made was to see the attack on the Twin Towers as an act of war launched by an undefined Muslim Islamic enemy. Actually, what it was a very successful and terrorist attack. And the mistake made by the Bush administration, and assisted by Tony Blair and others, was to regard it as an act of war. Now, if it had been pursued as a counter-terrorism operation, it would have been successful. And the world, remember, was so much in sympathy with the United States in September 2001. I mean, Iran was very offering assistance against the Taliban at the time. And those friendly advances were repudiated by the United States, which chose instead to embark on this nonsensical war, clash of civilizations adventure, in which they were taking on what they saw as an organized Muslim enemy, which actually didn't exist. There probably weren't any more than a few score Al-Qaeda operatives existing in and around Afghan by the end of 2001.
Join us after the break when Alex continues his discussion with journalist and broadcaster Peter Oborne. We'll see you then. Welcome back. Alex is in conversation with Peter Oborne about the ongoing situation in Afghanistan.
Let's look at the implications. Firstly, for America, because the story began in the attack on the Twin Towers, and successive American presidents have been embroiled in these conflicts. And it comes down to Joe Biden, who was very keen to say, I'm at the end of the line here. I'm the fourth American president to be thus involved, and I'm the one who's saying that it has to stop. I mean, doesn't Biden have a case and has consistently argued that the mighty dollar couldn't turn Afghanistan into a prototype Western democracy? That's been his consistent argument. So whatever
there are also, I've been watching video footage of Biden arguing that we were involved in a nation building enterprise. I'm sure you've seen that too. So I'm not quite sure he's as consistent as you say. And so America has been made to look ridiculous. And there are going to be consequences for the United States of the has got an event which has echoes of the fall of Saigon.
So just as the fall of Saigon had implications, or Jimmy Carter and the attempt to rescue the Iranian hostage had implications, it's really the act of looking weak, of it looking like chaos, which is the big danger for Joe Biden, that he looks exposed and ridiculous. Is that your argument?
Well, I mean, even if you think it was the right thing to do, it was still very badly executed. Now, let's look at the consequences for the American military presence elsewhere in what we might now start to call West Asia, Iraq, Syria. Biden has signaled that the United States is not that interested in the rest of the world. In that sense, he's adopted rather to my surprise, a Trumpian foreign policy, an isolationist foreign policy. Well, America's allies are going to think about in these areas, are going to look at it and think, well, do we really want to be an ally of America, or is America going to abandon us? This is quite a significant moment when China is steadily rising as an economic and increasingly as a political force.
And how about for Britain? I mean, there was this revealing moment when Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, sort of broke down on LBC radio, but even more revealing was his claim that after Trump started to treat with the Taliban, he actually considered building an alternative coalition to support the Afghanistan government. Was that ever feasible, that you could replace the United States in that venture?
This is another profound point we have to take away from this. I think that Western countries, for the time being at any rate, have lost the ability or the will to take casualties and so they're not going to stay in a place like Afghanistan where they can be targeted.
But wouldn't a more practical thing for a Defence Secretary to be doing would be to send in the Royal Regiment of Scotland to hold the airport for a few days, instead of theorising about how to hold a country for years?
I take my hat off in a way to Ben Wallace. He saw that there's clearly been a split between the United States and Britain. Britain wanted to hang on, and I think that the epic rapidity of this collapse and the scenes we've seen at of people trying to escape from Kabul, there was a sense of honour towards the Afghans who have supported the British Western presence, and I think Britain, to its credit, actually, has felt more of that sense of honour than, I'm afraid, the United States. Let's compare and contrast the United States ambassador, who reportedly scuttled as soon as he could. And that's a deep moment of shame for the State Department, I should say, in the United States, which he represented, against the British ambassador, who, there he is, he's still there, hanging around as long as he can, signing visa forms to get to Britain. And actually, Britain has conducted itself, partly due to this splendid emissary we have in Kabul, with great honour.
But how about the Russian ambassador who's taking selfies of the streets of Kabul?
Yes, and I would say I don't know why. It's very early days, but the Taliban appear to be behaving with great restraint. There's been no bloodshed in Kabul. There have been reports elsewhere, but it looks that there's been a big disjunction, actually, between the press reporting of this and all about the carnage of the Taliban and what we've actually seen, which has been much more restrained so far, including towards women. It's very early days, and we may be getting false reports. Now, the Russian ambassador is staying, and I don't know quite why we would leave at the moment, because the Taliban is not committing atrocities that we can see, certainly not in Kabul.
But isn't that the single significant claim that the coalition forces could make, that there has been an improvement in the life chances of so many Afghani women over these last 20 years? And is there any real hope that the freedoms they've enjoyed and the education they have been entitled to, is there any hope that will continue under Taliban rule?
I agree with you entirely. I think it is an enormous achievement, and it's not just the West. I think a lot of this is all framed in terms of the West. Remember, we're talking about a country which has its own traditions and independence and magnificence. It's exceptionally lovely people and a very beautiful place, by the way, where you can always, in my considerable experience, get a lot of hospitality and warmth. And yes, there has been a wonderful change towards education for boys and girls in particular, because there wasn't a lot before. There's been a great advance. Kabul itself was, if you think, go back 20 years, it was pretty well destroyed. And now it's quite a flourishing, modern-looking city in many ways. So these are changes, and I think that the coalition presence has done some good. It's looking, early days, but looking really hopeful in that way.
And that would be indicated, Peter Oborne, in that extraordinary press conference a couple of days ago where the Taliban gave all sorts of assurances of no reprisals, that life would go on and a more effective government. That rather took the Western press corps by surprise, did it not?
Well, it made a nonsense of a lot of the Western press reporting, which was stuck in these kind of Orientalist sort of reporting of subject matter, which they were only capable of dictating through Western eyes. But so there is every reason to hope that that this will be a different kind of country than the one which existed 25 years ago. But let's see.
Peter Oborne, the impact of this Taliban victory on Afghanistan's near neighbours, Pakistan in particular. The Taliban now have an army of 65,000 people, thanks to the American State Department and the Pentagon, superbly well equipped with American weapons. Is this a threat to their near neighbours, or will there be celebrations in Pakistan that the Taliban are now their neighbours?
Pakistan has got to manage its relationship with the new regime in Kabul, and I would have thought it will do so in a sensible way. And I don't think it's our business to try and tell Pakistan what to do. That's what George Bush, who threatened to bomb Pakistan into the Stone Age, said that to President Musharraf, or his people did 20 years ago. And I hope that we have the wisdom to leave Pakistan to manage its connection with the Taliban.
And looking at the sweep of history, when all the tales are written, the stories understood, where will this fit in Afghanistan's history? Will it be just another attempted invasion by another foreign interloper, which was eventually repelled, and life in Afghanistan will go on? Or will this be the last time somebody marches on Kabul?
Well, last time for the time being. And by the way, I've heard various British MPs who really ought to know better saying we'll be going back in. That's nonsense. Britain won't. The other question I would put, the Russians got thrown out of Afghanistan, and that was the end of the Soviet Empire. Is the Americans suffering this scale of defeat in Afghanistan going to be the end of the American empire? Certainly, I think it is in in that part of the world. I think that but it's got deep implications for what we should no longer call the Middle East, but we should start to call West Asia. I think the Americans are going to retreat in on themselves. I don't think the United States of America will collapse in the way the Soviet Union did, but I think it's going to have a different perspective on the world.
Peter Oborne, thank you so much for joining me once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
More than 30 years ago, Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan in disarray. What followed was the total collapse of the Soviet Empire. This week it was America and her allies who turned and fled from Kabul. Will this presage the end of the American empire, or at least of America as a dominant world power with the appetite to impose its military will worldwide? However, if this was humiliation from America, they were not alone in their embarrassment. Virtually the entire Western media was hysterically predicting a bloodbath in Afghanistan, only to be faced by a victorious Taliban who sounded conciliatory, even magnanimous, in their moment of military triumph. Now, it may be, of course, that the warm words from the Taliban will be replaced by descent into barbarism. It may be that lives of women and girls in the country will become increasingly difficult, and all of the great gains made in education and basic human rights will be reversed. However, the early signs do not seem to point in this direction. Right now, the question should be exactly what did the 3,500 coalition troops, the more than 65,000 Afghan forces, and the 200,000 die for? The sacrifice was used by their leaders to prop up a venal, decadent, and totally corrupt puppet government. That river of blood is squarely in the hands of those who supported this long, desultory, neo-colonial conflict. And then there's the treasure expended. $900 billion by America, $30 billion by the UK, and $20 billion by Germany. That sort of expenditure on constructive, targeted aid could have turned Afghanistan into a paradise on earth, or lifted countless millions across the planet out of poverty and misery. Of course, the combatants in this latest Afghan war have an obligation to take in the inevitable exodus of refugees. However, the important issue is not just the tens of thousands fleeing, but the fate of the 38 million Afghans who stay in their own country. Perhaps it's time, after 20 long years, for the Western world to develop a viable non-military strategy to improve the lot of the people of Afghanistan. And so from Tasmina, myself, and all at the show, it's goodbye for now. Stay safe. We'll see you all again next week.